Inside the perfect home, the perfect crime. The evidence is all circumstantial.
Sometimes you recover a weapon, you recover a set of fingerprints, which are conclusive, but not in this case.
Police have a prime suspect, but it will be a tough case to prove. Investigators want to bring a 10-year-old cold case back to life. Can the experts at North Mission Road help make it happen?
There wasn't really hard, solid forensic evidence like fingerprints, blood, DNA evidence, witnesses. Instead, you had a very circumstantial case. You'll look at the coroner's photographs of wounds, of individual wounds, at the time that the autopsy is done. And you're looking for angles. You're looking for some evidence at what position the victim is in when fired upon.
That was a clip from an episode of Dateline featuring cold case detective J. Warner Wallace, who later went on to write Cold Case Christianity and more recently, The Truth in True Crime. On this edition of the Humble Skeptic Podcast, I'll be talking with Detective Wallace about following the evidence wherever it leads. Whether in attempting to solve a murder case, resolving disputed claims about the recent or ancient past, or even challenging our beliefs about the true nature of our world.
Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome back to the Humble Skeptic Podcast. I'm Shane Rosenthal, and on this episode, you'll be hearing from retired cold case detective J. Warner Wallace. I'll first talk with him about some of the conflicting information that I've uncovered about the Executive Room piano bar, and whether he has ever had cases where the evidence seems to point in two different directions. From there, we'll make some applications to the way we attempt to resolve real or apparent discrepancies that exist between the four gospel accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. If you had a chance to listen to the last few episodes, you'll recall that I recently reopened my own investigation related to my dad's story of seeing Billy Joel perform at the piano bar that inspired his song Piano Man. In particular, my recent interview with John Gibson corroborated my dad's claim that the bar was located in the lobby of a large office building on the corner of Western and Wilshire. The problem, however, is that this corroborated testimony appears to be in conflict with evidence related to the bar itself. There are pictures online of the bar at a different location, and according to available records, it was at this location before, during, and after 1973, while Billy Joel played at this bar. Furthermore, no one has yet been able to locate any records that confirm a secondary location for the Executive Room. Because of this, I haven't been able to convince Bob Egan of my position. Bob is the owner of a website called PopSpots that features pictures of the Executive Room at an entirely different intersection. In fact, when I contacted him after he listened to the John Gibson interview, he wrote me back saying, quote, "I guess unless we can go back in time, it's going to be like the Kennedy assassination. Hopefully, new clues come in the future to seal the deal one way or the other." End quote. So I decided to share my story with retired detective J. Warner Wallace in order to get his thoughts about the evidence that I've collected thus far. In short, I wanted to know whether he thought this case was still undecided or whether there was already enough evidence to go to trial.
Well, remember, the standard is not beyond a possible doubt in trials, in jury trials. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a much lower standard. But of course, this is very different, right? I mean, part of the problem is that when we bring in witnesses to a trial, we test them. We don't just trust them. There's actually a jury selection process. So we get the jurors in place, and then we instruct the jurors. And there's jury instructions in California, for example, that allow you to ask 13 questions in your mind of anyone who's testifying in a trial. And those questions really kind of break down into 4 areas. Were they really there to see what they said they saw? Can they be corroborated in some way, knowing that corroboration is not going to be a video recording in my cases at least, are just too old. And the third thing is, have they changed their story over time? And finally, do they have a reason to lie to us? And if you test them in those 4 areas and they pass that test, you are to consider their testimony reliable according to the jury instructions. In other words, if you don't have a reason to doubt them that can be raised by somebody, you're not to doubt them. So that's the standard for jury trials. Now, I think probably a lot of the stuff that you guys are comparing here, and I'm not sure of all the details in your dad's story, but a lot of it is just going to be a matter of testing him in those 4 categories.
Well, in my dad's case, I was under the impression, based on some of the conflicting data, that maybe he was mistaken. Especially if Billy Joel wasn't famous in that time. Maybe he mistook some other guy that looked like Billy Joel. But then when I started listening carefully to the details of his story, he's saying it's an office building on Western and Wilshire. Billy Joel says similar things. And then I get corroboration from John Gibson, who is a TV news anchor who worked with Billy Joel, who said, yeah, it was at an office building and it was on Western and Wilshire. So it seems like if you have corroborated testimony from something 50 years ago, from independent witnesses, and you set that in contrast with other conflicting data, I'm wondering if you have a priority for evidence.
Well, what's the other conflicting data that's going to come down?
Well, one of the theories I put forth in my first podcast was that maybe they changed locations, because there's a picture of a place. It says the executive room. It's on a 2020 special. They interview people there. They remember Billy Joel coming. But it's a single-story building in between a deli and a Chinese restaurant a few blocks away. Phone book records show they didn't change locations. It was there in 1970, 72, 73. So maybe they had 2 locations at the time. Maybe they had renovation work. I don't know how to explain the conflicting data, but I do know I've got 2 credible witnesses who place it elsewhere.
You just said there's other ways to explain the data.
Yeah.
So that's where you come down. It's always going to be something like this, that someone says something that seems implausible to you. There's no way, but it's because you don't understand what the conflicting data is.
Yeah. But I do have a very credible witness who worked in the industry, who went there multiple occasions, saying it was at this large office building, Western Wilshire. So what would be weird, like if Billy Joel worked at this other place, the single story place, it'd be weird for 2 witnesses to get it wrong in exactly the same way.
Well, that's exactly how we would consider it in a trial.
Yeah.
So what is corroborative? Corroborative could be something physical that corroborates a piece of the story. It could be another eyewitness who corroborates something. And for sure, if they're independent and have no contact with each other and they give you some weird detail that seems hard to imagine, to guess incorrectly from 2 different sources, I think that's pretty strong. Now, the question then becomes, well, then why doesn't it match up with this piece number C or letter C? Well, then there's something, like in the end, one of these is probably going to be inaccurate, or there's some other way for both of them to be correct and we just can't figure it out. And look at how hard it is for you to figure this out just 50 years later, yet you're having a hard time making all of these things line up. Imagine if you're 2,000 years downstream from the event and you're thinking, well, how could both of these things be true at the same time? And that's why we have to, I think, be fair. The more ancient the claim becomes, that there may be something that we don't understand. I had a case, for example, one time where a woman found her coworker dead. She runs in she sees the car, her coworker's car, out in the parking lot, and she knows right away something's not right. This girl shouldn't be here. I mean, she's what should have gone home last night. So already she's got this bad feeling that something's wrong. So she runs to the business, opens the door, comes in, and finds her coworker dead on the floor. So the question at trial becomes, well, was the back door opened? Was it locked or unlocked? She got it wrong. And of course, the defense attorney wants to say, well, you can't trust anything she's telling us about what she discovered because she's wrong about the door.
Yeah.
But if I can explain why she may have been so panicked seeing the car in the parking lot that she's no longer thinking about anything along the way, she just wants to see what's going on in that business, that can explain why she's wrong about the door.
Yeah.
She's still reliable about the crime scene? Yes. Is she wrong about the door? Yes. You can be wrong about a detail and still be considered reliable. So that's something we can at least consider. Even if your dad was wrong about a detail, it doesn't mean he was wrong about seeing Billy Joel.
Since none of us is omniscient, we often have to make decisions based on limited or incomplete information. And in some cases, it can be difficult to put all the puzzle pieces together. So given your background, what advice can you give about dealing with cases in which the evidence appears to be telling two different stories?
Well, first of all, it's not that occasionally we make decisions or render inferences with less than perfect information. That's every single inference about anything you're about to do today or in a criminal trial. For every single thing you're about to do, you hold less than perfect information. So we tell jurors all the time, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, but I cannot tell you everything that could be known because I don't know. I still have opening. One of the questions we'll ask jurors is, are you the kind of person who can render a verdict with unanswered questions? If someone says, no, I can't really, there's no way, this is a life and death thing. This is a murder trial. There's no way I can render a verdict if I have unanswered questions, but we're going to dismiss that person. We're not going to impanel him because that's a person who, look, I've never been able to answer every question for every trial.
Now I think I know how to get out of jury duty.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. There's more than one way to get out of jury duty, but some people will try to keep you because there's other mitigating factors. They say, I don't care about that. I like this part of who that person is. I want him on my jury. So it doesn't mean you can necessarily get out. But the point is, there are some things that we're looking for. In the end, if you have witnesses in which their witnesses they bring forward are just as convincing, just as credible, they pass all the tests, well, then you are probably going to end up with a hung jury or with something that's not going to produce a conviction.
Yeah.
That's the whole point, is that we have to be able to say, well, no, we've got, like in your case where you've got a couple of people who have this unusual description the exact same way, jurors will have to evaluate that and say, well, what are the odds they could guess that right twice from two different people?
And it's the jurors who get to place the weight of evidence on whatever evidence there is, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So there's no, when we talk about evidence sets, especially cumulative cases, that's what you're doing here, is you are building a case for the reliability of your dad's testimony. And you're building it on pieces. And the more pieces you have that point to him as reliable, the better the inference. Could you still be wrong? Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, even he says that. He said he's 95% sure.
Right.
I was trying to figure out, was he one of the characters mentioned in the song? And but then my brother told me, well, there's no way that could be true because Wikipedia says X. And then I find out that there's conflicting information online. So it kind of was like on again, off again. Do I believe my dad just because he said it?
So if you said Wikipedia says, that should stop you in your tracks right there, because that is not something that is sourced. Usually if it is sourced, it's sourced by individual people. I've seen so many things on Wikipedia that I have to go. It's a good place to start an investigation because it might give you some sources, but it's not a great place to end. Now, you mentioned something, I think, earlier about, well, could you trust your dad? Well, that's something that's very important. If you said, no, why would he lie about this? What's in it for him? That's one of the things we talk about is what would cause you to lie? What is your bias? What is your motive?
Yeah. I trusted my dad, so I didn't think anything of it. I'm just automatically assuming maybe he's one of the guys in the song. I don't know. Did he talk to John the bartender and Davey in the Navy? But my brother said we lived in West Virginia at the time, so it couldn't have happened. So I just assumed he was mistaken. And then my mom said when we lived in West Virginia, he happened to go on a business trip in the spring of that year. Right. So that it became plausible again. It's a good lesson for me to think about why things are plausible and things are not. Like, you were a non-believer. I was a non-believer. You ridiculed Christians and kind of made fun of their beliefs in ways that you now regret. So did I. But there's a reason why it was all implausible to me because of certain presuppositions I had in my head. I automatically dismissed things without the complete information, just like I automatically dismissed my dad could have been there because we live in West Virginia until certain new facts came in that opened up new possibilities. So I'm wondering, like, for you, did you ever work on a case where you had a certain kind of mindset and then new evidence comes in that opens up a new door where you see everything in a new way?
Oh, absolutely. That's pretty common depending on the kind of case you're working. Of course, Dateline would love to have all of my cases be that way. I mean, I think I've been on Dateline more than anyone else, but those cases that got on Dateline, they all want a twist. After the second commercial, we want to string people along in the wrong direction and then pull the rug out from under them. And that's not, unfortunately, always the case. I mean, there's lots of cases where you know who the guy is from the beginning. The problem is making the case in front of a jury.
Right.
So you're just trying to develop the evidence set that would compel a jury to render a verdict of guilty. But there are lots where you start off and you're not quite sure who it is, and you chase a lead. And I've had several that looked really good. I mean, his statements were sideways. There was physical evidence that I thought was really, I was just waiting for the DNA to come back, and I was sure he's going to be the guy. And it turns out I was completely wrong. That's why we take a look at corroborative evidence and we treat it so, because in the end, it's not a matter of whether what I think. It's a matter of what can I demonstrate to a jury. There are many times when you have a case that you think is going in a certain direction. It's usually early. It's usually in the first month of working a case that you think, oh, I've got the right guy, and you're focused because everything tells you should focus here. And there's usually a time issue. We got to move fast. He's going to do things. He's going to destroy evidence. We got to get the search warrant done. We got to move quickly on this guy. And that's why we stay so laser focused.
Yeah. Just
to find out that either the search warrant doesn't show us something, or in my case, the DNA came back to somebody else. And then you realize, okay, as good as this guy looks, he's not the guy.
One of the things that the owner of this other website said, he was highlighting on his website where Piano Man took place. And, when I presented the evidence from the corroborated testimony, he said, well, memory from 50 years ago isn't something that would hold up in court. Since you've worked in the, this world, do you think that memory from 30, 40, or 50 years ago can be trusted?
Oh, of course.
What's the oldest cold case you worked on?
72.
Wow, really?
We didn't solve it till 2019. So here's the issue, a couple of things. Number one, typically when people tell you something from 30 years ago, remember, it's all going to be about how significant. I'll give you an example of this. I've had 46 Valentine's Days with my wife. And I couldn't probably tell you what I did this Valentine's Day, let alone the other 40 plus Valentine's Days. But if you ask me what we did on Valentine's Day in 1988, I can give you an hour by hour because that's the day we got married. So it turns out not every Valentine's Day memory is the same for me. One stands out because it was unique. I only did that once, had one wedding. I'm not going to confuse it for any other event that's similar because I've never been involved in another event that's similar. Most people who see a murder, I've only seen one.
It stands out.
It stands out in their mind.
Yeah.
That's typically what happens in these murder cases because they're so gruesome. They stick out in the mind of the people. Now, if you're the kind of person who saw something that you consider to be breathtakingly miraculous, and not only did you talk about it, but you talked about it consistently everywhere you lived, every day for 30 years, and then you penned it in a gospel. Well, first of all, the gospel could be 30 years after the actual events. But these are singularly miraculous events that changed people's lives, that they didn't just keep to themselves until 30 years later and try to recall, that they talked about from the very beginning.
And furthermore, they weren't like an eyewitness to a murder, which is just an instantaneous thing. They were with this person for 3 years, hearing the same speeches over and over again. That's a different kind of an experience.
No, it is a different kind of experience. And they were very, very verbal about it. They were told by the master who they observed that they were to go and make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them everything that I taught you. In other words, Jesus inaugurated a teaching culture. Now, I think you could argue, how can you trust a 50-year anecdotal memory of something insignificant? That's different. I've had that happen in court. It happens all the time where the defense attorney will challenge the eyewitness. You mean to tell me? And of course, he'll set it up very carefully. So it was nighttime, right? Oh, yeah, it was nighttime. Was it kind of rainy? It was kind of rainy. He's trying to basically argue it's dark, visibility is terrible, and you couldn't have remembered this 30 years later. And we'll just come up and redirect and say, so tell me, how many murders have you seen?
Right.
One.
Yep.
Do you think it'll stick out in your mind? Oh, I'll never forget that day. Jurors get it. You don't even need to say anything.
But when it comes to evaluating the testimonies recorded in the Gospels, you have not just one person's recollection, but we have 4 different accounts.
Yes.
And these 4 different accounts, in some places, aren't easy to harmonize. I'm guessing if you're like me, you probably don't have everything quite figured out just yet.
I think for the most part, I had to work through those. So let's just put it this way. One of the things that compelled me to start the whole testing process that I went through, that I document in Cold Case Christianity, were the variations. So in other words, I saw these variations and had never really read the story of Jesus. And so I went ahead and I bought a Pew Bible And I just started working through the variations, because what struck me immediately was the number of places where there were variations in the accounts. Here's why. That's so common. It's so common in every set of eyewitness accounts. I got cases from just, if it happened right now and we went out and there were 6 witnesses to this murder and they had been properly separated. That's the only thing we ask. Separate the eyewitnesses before we get there. And so they've been properly separated so they can't confer with each other. Great. Then we get there. I guarantee you there will be levels of variation between the accounts that 10 years from now, if we go to trial, a defense attorney is going to make a huge deal out of those variations. But we expect those. And we know that we want to preserve those, because we could easily say to the witness, Jack over here, he told me something slightly different. Do you want to change your statement? No, we're recording these and we want the variations to stay, because it turns out they all harmonize. And as awkward and as difficult as they can be, they typically harmonize. And again, if someone's wrong about a detail, it's often a tangential minor detail that they miss that's not important to the case, and they're still going to be considered reliable even though they're wrong about a detail. That's what we just talked about.
Yep.
So I'm trying to preserve all the dirty messiness between the accounts.
Yeah, and you say that the dirty messiness gives it the authenticity, but whenever you see like complete harmony, you're inclined to believe that there's either been contamination or they're working together to pull the wool over your eyes.
Well, and do you think that the skeptics, if they found that all the Gospels were word for word, some were just longer than others, had more details than others, but where they were mentioning the same thing, they were word for word, do you think they'd be more comfortable with them? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So I think there's the problem, right? So I guess the question I think for a lot of people becomes, well, how can this be the inerrant word of God, yet there be variations that seem hard to resolve? Well, okay, if what God was trying to deliver to us were a set of true eyewitness accounts, either written by the eyewitness himself or by somebody the eyewitness was telling about the account so that the report writer is right. Either way, it's an eyewitness account.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when I get a report, it is written by a detective who interviewed an eyewitness. That's an eyewitness account. Although it's not written in hand by the eyewitness, it's still an eyewitness account. So Luke is writing down eyewitness accounts, even though he is not an eyewitness in Luke's gospel.
So we shouldn't consider Luke's gospel hearsay.
Well, first of all, the standard for a criminal trial is different than the standard for doing history. So yes, if you wanted to say, look, I can only trust somebody I could cross-examine, and that's really the goal of dismissing hearsay evidence. We want any accused person to be able to confront his accuser, including a witness who says they saw him do something. So that's a very different standard. Why? Because we would rather let 100 guilty people go than wrongly convict one person.
Right.
So we have a high standard, which is not reasonable. Because let's put it this way. If you had a standard where you have to cross-examine an eyewitness to know if something's true, if your dad died, you'd never be able to even look at the case because you can't talk to your dad about it. You wouldn't know anything about your great-great-grandparents because they're not alive.
Yeah.
So there's the problem.
There goes history.
Yeah, you're going to lose all of history. So in the end, that's a different standard. But let's put it this way. If I wanted to know what happened in a case in 1972, but was kind of bummed out because all of the eyewitnesses are now dead and I could never go to trial with this, I could still know what occurred and who did the murder, even though I know, based on the death of these eyewitnesses, I could never go to a criminal trial. But I could still say, well, this case is closed. I'm not going to continue looking for the killer. I know who the killer is. The problem is just that I don't have the kind of living eyewitnesses that could convict a killer right now. So that just means, but that's a different issue. Can I make a case in my own mind that I know what happened versus can I make a case in front of a jury that doesn't violate someone's rights?
In one place, when it comes to sorting through different kinds of testimony that you sometimes get from different witnesses, you say that in California, jurors are specifically instructed not to, quote, automatically reject testimony just because of inconsistencies or conflicts. Why is that an important thing to tell a juror before they decide on a case?
Well, okay, because it turns out that everything is fallible. If your reporter is fallible, we already know that. Could I be wrong about a detail again and be right about and be considered reliable about this other detail? That's what the jurors are going to be tasked with having to decide. And that's because we're not robots, right? We are, and even there's even been times when I've had, like video evidence that's so, because most of my stuff is so old that the quality of the video evidence, only gets you so far. And you can say, well, this is about the right build, but it's not high def. And so I'm really going to be struggling to know if that's really him. but it sure looks like him.
Yeah.
That's about as close as you're going to get. So I think that there's the problem, is that we have to allow for the nature of, so part of that jury instruction is that, hey, people make mistakes. And the jury instruction tells them that even though they can make mistakes, they can still be considered reliable.
Yeah.
You have to assess why might they have made a mistake over here, yet be reliable over there.
This, of course, raises the question as to whether it's possible that one of the Gospels contains incorrect or mistaken information. Sometimes in conversations with skeptics, I found that it's actually a helpful tactic to suggest, for the sake of argument, that one way to resolve an important difference between, say, Matthew and Luke would be to suggest that perhaps Matthew made a mistake. If you think about it, Paul makes a suggestion similar to this in 1 Corinthians 15, when he writes, "If Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain." Now, if Matthew ended up making some kind of unimportant factual error, this would not have the effect of undermining the entire Christian faith. Rather, it would simply be an indication for Christians that Matthew's gospel should not be included as part of the inspired New Testament canon. But as Jim Wallace indicated, this does not mean that Matthew isn't trustworthy, since, as he stated, sometimes reliable witnesses can make honest mistakes. Therefore, the result of this thought experiment would simply be that Christians would have one less book as part of the New Testament canon. But all of us, Christians and skeptics alike, would still have to deal with the historical evidence that Matthew presents for Jesus' life, death, and resurrection on the third day.
I'll just tell you that from my perspective as a guy coming into this I was not raised in the church, don't know any Christians growing up, that word inerrancy I'd never heard before. That's not something I'd ever considered.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had an inerrant witness. I have had many reliable witnesses, though. And that's the difference between possible doubt and reasonable doubt. And that gap between possible and reasonable are all of your unanswered questions, the things I just can't figure out. But I can tell you I'm beyond a reasonable doubt that he did it, but I can't tell you how or why or when. Those are details I don't have, but I know that. So I just needed to know, do I have good, reliable witnesses that would convince me that the resurrection occurred? Period. And if there are variations between these, I don't see anything in the gospel accounts that I wouldn't see in other cases involving reliable eyewitnesses in which a murder really did occur. And the guy who did it really did do it, because after we convicted him, he confessed to it. So I know I get the right guy.
Yeah.
And if I showed you the evidence set, it would not have been nearly as good as the gospel eyewitness evidence set. Yet I know I have the right guy.
One of the things you say is that it's super important to avoid being a know-it-all. You write, all of us hold presuppositions that can impact the way we see the world around us. I've learned to do my best to enter every investigation with my eyes open to all the reasonable possibilities. I try not to bite on any particular philosophy or theory until one emerges as the most rational, given the evidence. I've learned this the hard way. I'm wondering if you might be able to give us an example of what you're talking about there. How did a particular theory blind you from rightly apprehending the evidence?
Part of this is what I really talk about in a whole chapter of The Truth and True Crime, is that the one thing that changes everything is a principle that's been studied on the sociological research for about 35 years now. It is the one thing that if humans adopt it, it provides the most in terms of human flourishing. It changes every single metric, from how much money you make to how healthy you'll be, to how long you'll live, to how deep your relationships will be, to how smart you are. It's one thing, and it's called humility. Humility is the one thing that changes everything. You can't teach people who aren't humble because they already think they know the answer. You can't convince an investigator of a different theory for the murder if he already thinks he knows how this is going to go. This is often the case when you have a woman who's killed in her bedroom. Well, who is she dating? Who's she married to? Who's she sleeping with? Who's her most intimate male friend? Well, why do we assume that? We assume that because that is most of the time.
Happens a lot.
It is exactly how you solve these cases. At least that's going to be our first line of investigation.
Yeah.
But if I said, okay, that's what it's going to be, but I'm not going to move off of that because I've never been wrong.
Right.
Well, then good luck. And I had a case like that where it was a complete stranger who did the murder, and it looked very intimate. You have to be able to move off what you think you know based on what you've done in the past. Because a lot of it is, let's face it, when you're working in a team of detectives, there's a competition on the team to be the first guy to figure it out. And so you got to avoid all that. That's all driven by pride, just the opposite of humility. And I think this is the one thing we could learn, which I don't know why it took me so many years to see it. It's on every page of scripture. If you just took your Bible and said, okay, when I buy a new Bible, I take notes in my Bible. And so they're filled with notes. And most of them are investigative notes. Well, if you just did this for yourself and said, this year, I'm going to read my Bible only considering the issue of humility.
It's everywhere.
Through that lens, you will see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And it turns out that there's no way that anyone bends their knee to the existence of a God who doesn't first have to say, I'm not God.
Yeah.
It's humility that opens the door to everything else.
I think C.S. Lewis said that every time we open up a book, we're taking the posture of humility, because you're basically opening up to another perspective, you know?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so I think this is one of the things that's the first principle of investigations. It's the first principle in cold case Christianity. It's also the first principle I write about in The Truth and True Crime, is that if you want wisdom, you're going to have to recognize you fail.
And this becomes super important in, the big worldview questions, I mean, one of the things you also say is that a lot of times our presuppositions are hidden from us.
Oh, absolutely.
And that makes them hard to recognize. So how do you think that, how does that affect the way we deal with issues related to the big worldview questions?
Well, okay, so like in an investigation, it's important for us to have a team, because somebody on that team may have an angle that you didn't see. And if you don't dismiss him or her, but you actually look at her and say, hey, well, why are you seeing it that way? And say, at least initially, because we don't know what's caused this.
Yeah.
We should chase all these leads equally until one of them starts to become the one. That helps. Same thing is true in your spiritual walk. That's why it's so dangerous to be like a Lone Ranger Christian, right? Where you say, okay, I got a Bible now. And having never read the Bible before, not even knowing necessarily what written voices in commentaries in other books I should listen to.
Yeah.
You can get in some really weird places if you try to do it all on your own. It turns out you're looking for authoritative voices who maybe know more about the cultural context, about the initial languages, the original words that were being used, that can help you to navigate that. So that's why it's important, I think, to do this in community.
But there's also the other side of it. Like, if you come from a secular side and you're never challenging your own ideas, you just start with those presuppositions that there can never be a miracle. I mean, you quote Bart Ehrman saying something to that effect. The bottom line, I think he writes, is whether there can be such a thing as any historical evidence for a miracle. And I think the answer is clearly no, since that ends up invoking something outside our natural experience to explain what happened in the past. What do you think is wrong with that way of reasoning?
Well, I think because all of us know there's something outside of our natural reasoning that has caused something that we are now enjoying. And I think that if you look at Big Bang cosmology, this idea that everything in the universe leaps into existence, all space, time, and matter, does not create itself, and it's not infinitely old. Somehow this comes into existence from a cause that's outside of space, time, and matter. And we would call that by definition something extra natural, because nature is simply what we examine in space, time, and matter. If we're talking about something outside of space, time, and matter, we're now jumping out of what we would call natural.
Yeah.
Yet we believe there's something that's profoundly powerful enough to create everything from nothing. The only question is this thing personal or impersonal? Is it an impersonal force?
Yeah.
Or is it a personal being? If it is a personal being, there's no New Testament miracle that's really all that big of a deal.
Right.
Those are all small potato miracles given what we see in Genesis 1. If there's a being out there that can create everything from nothing, I'm guessing he can enter his creation and walk on water. But what are we trying to do? We're trying to get back and eliminate anything that might be considered extra natural. I think that even Bart Ehrman would say that if there wasn't a single miracle in the New Testament at all, it's just about a preaching rabbi in the first century, nobody would doubt anything that Jesus ever did or said once you take the miracles out. But you insert one miracle, and now there's massive skepticism, which reveals that it's not a manuscript evidence issue. The teaching about Sermon on the Mount in Luke appears different than the teaching in Matthew. No, that's not the issue. The issue is there's a miracle present. And that's what discredits everything. And that goes to show you where our bias really is.
And it's a particularly secular, naturalistic bias. I mean, it's not a bias that most people throughout most times have had. So when it comes to evaluating potential worldviews, the key is to be open to the evidence wherever it leads. But my question to you is, if you're a secularist and you say there can't be any miracles because you've defined the world in a certain way, I'm wondering if we would be willing to do that same kind of self-examination. For example, would you, if the best evidence available of a given case including hard evidence and corroborated testimony, did actually point in the direction of a UFO or a ghostly encounter, would you allow yourself to go there? Because, a lot of people are going to think you're crazy when you report this testimony. And look, I saw it. My friend saw it.
Yes.
I'm more the kind of a place where I say, I need to build a case inductively from the evidence wherever it leads. And I'm open to the world being weird.
Yeah, yeah, me too. I mean, those kinds of issues. So I think that one of the problems you might have is if you thought up front that a UFO would invalidate Christianity, then I think you might use that fear, because you're so connected to your Christian worldview, to not be fair to the investigation of the UFO.
Yeah.
I don't think it makes any difference at all.
Neither do I.
To our Christian worldview. For me, it's about abductive reasoning. It's about saying, okay, what's the evidence? And what are the explanations for the evidence?
Yeah, what's the best explanation for the evidence you've seen yet?
Yes. So once I have the evidence set, and it has to be complete for me, I have to have all of it. That would take me some time. I need to have all of those explanations and see which one is the most explanatory.
So even some Christian historians will say things like, on purely historical grounds, we can't prove that Jesus actually rose again from the dead. At best, all we can say is that the disciples had an experience that they believed was Jesus' resurrection. Do you agree with that kind of reasoning?
Well, okay, so historians have a different way of talking about this.
Right.
And my way of talking about it is simply, could you make the case in front of a jury? Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? So if you said, I can't prove X, I don't think you can prove anything. Proof's in the eye of the juror. I'm going to present evidence for this. You're going to make an inference from the evidence. I never tell someone, I'm going to prove to you this happened. My standard is not beyond a possible doubt. My standard is beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, if you said, well, I mean, you can make the same argument about any historical event that you did not observe.
That's right.
That you can about Jesus. If it's 300 years ago, 400 years ago, 100 years ago, there's no way you can know any of these beyond a possible doubt, because that standard is just too high. The question is, can you be certain beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the question. So if I look at the case, and when I draw it now for students, I typically will say, okay, there's the evidence for God's existence. I talk about that in a book called God's Crime Scene. That's just 8 lines of evidence from the physical universe that I think point most reasonably to God's existence. Then there's the case for the reliability of Scripture. That's part of the overall cumulative circumstantial case. Then there's the case for the resurrection being the best explanation for the empty tomb and the eyewitness observations. Then there's the case that only the actual Messiah, only God himself, could have the kind of impact that Jesus had on history in art, literature, music, education, science, and world religions. I wrote about that in Person of Interest. Then finally, there's the case that it turns out, if Christianity is true, its foundational scriptural documents ought to describe us the way we really are.
Yeah.
And it does. And that's in the Truth and True Crime. So I think for me, it's all of these things. They all point to the same reasonable inference. And in order to deny that, you have to explain how there's a amazing series of coincidences.
Right.
So that's the same kind of thinking that goes into, well, if 2 people said it was in a major office building and it was in the ground floor,
yeah,
who would just guess that? And I think that's one of the things about the case for Christianity is that Lewis said about how he sees everything now that he sees the truth of Christianity. Everything else begins to kind of click. The rest of the world starts to make sense.
Yeah.
And that's what I think happens when you take a look at the entire case. It is a large, cumulative, circumstantial case that shows that the best and most reasonable inference from evidence is that the Gospels are describing a true event.
So how would you respond to a skeptic who told you that, since the resurrection is the least likely thing to ever occur, it's a very improbable thing, how could that ever be the best explanation to any situation? In other words, how could we make a probabilistic argument with such a highly improbable thing?
Well, that's the question we're examining. So we cannot begin by reject. So the question we're saying is, could a supernatural explanation like the resurrection of Jesus be the most reasonable inference from evidence? That's the question.
Right.
But you can't start off by saying, well, no, it can't be. Well, no, that's the whole point of the investigation. And the question has to be then, well, how else could I explain those minimal facts that Gary Habermas always talks about? But for me, I didn't know anything about Gary's work. I just knew, as an atheist, I would have given you like maybe 3 or 4 things. I would have said, yep, the tomb is probably empty, because I'll tell you what, you could end this controversy in the 1st century by just getting the body out. 2, I think that they actually made these claims. I believe that Jesus lived and died on a cross and there was an empty tomb. That's pretty minimal.
Right.
So then the question, and the people made claims that you don't have to believe are true. They made claims and they were willing to be very committed to those claims. You don't need to believe they're true, but those are the things I would have said. So I'll give you those 3 or 4 or 5 things, but so then the question becomes, well, how do you explain them? It's abductive reasoning. I got the evidence. The evidence is just an empty tomb, a report of a resurrection, and people were committed to the report. Okay. Well, there's like 7 ways to explain that. Only one is the Christian explanation. Now, of course, the liability for the Christian explanation is that it requires something supernatural. But that's where you have to go back and ask yourself, well, don't you already think that there's something outside of space, time, and matter that has power and acts to create the universe to begin with? If that's something you're willing to entertain, and I was as an atheist who believed in Big Bang cosmology, not that that everything comes into existence, that all space, time, and matter begins at the beginning of the universe, and that happens at a point in the past we can point to and put some years on it. So if that's the case, whatever is the cause of that thing, anything that's caused has a causer. It cannot be itself. You cannot create yourself. So it has to be something outside of space, time, and matter. So that means I've got to at least be open-handed about what people would say makes this unreasonable, which is that it requires a cause, a force outside of space, time, and matter.
Well, folks, you've been hearing from J. Warner Wallace, author of Cold Case Christianity, Person of Interest, and more recently, The Truth in True Crime. I'll provide links to these books and other related resources in the show notes, along with information about upcoming speaking events, including a panel discussion on the resurrection that I've been invited to sit on with Gary Habermas and others in Houston, Texas this November. Simply head to humbleskeptic.com for more information, and please remember that this podcast is listener-supported. The address again is humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com, and I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.